Welcome, everybody. We're going to give you a minute or two to join us. You are a particularly large group today. There are hundreds and hundreds of you who have registered for this program, so we'll take an extra moment to give you all a chance to settle in and get oriented. I'm Julie Moose. I'm the Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, which is working to close the gap between journalism and civic engagement. And I really appreciate you all being here, and I especially appreciate our moderator and panelists for being here with us today as well. We're looking forward to a really provocative and powerful conversation. We know it'll be important, and we're very interested in you adding your voice to it and your questions and your perspective. So we're going to start with a conversation among our panelists, and we would just ask you to go ahead and add your questions to the Q&A queue anytime, and we'll start bringing them into the program a little bit later. So to get us started, I am really thrilled to introduce Juliet Beverly. Juliet is content manager with brainfacts.org at the Society for Neuroscience, and she's been there 7 years, and she's been working in the science writing space for 12 years. Juliet is a member of the National Press Club, and she is a founding member of Writing Through, which is the Journalism Institute's writing group. And she is always a shining source of wisdom there, and as importantly, a source of willingness to have hard, deep conversations about who we are and who we want to be. So, Juliet, thank you, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Julie. For me, and I've shared this with the panelists already, but for me, racism is like The Matrix, that 1999 classic film. It's systemic, coded, and pervasive. And like Morpheus presented to Neo, journalism has a choice. We can take the red pill and talk about the truth, revealing the evolving algorithms at play, or take the blue pill and continue to prop up the construct fueled by centuries-old tropes and bias. Today, I'm joined in conversation with Leah, Donnella, an editor on NPR's Code Switch team and creator of the Ask Code Switch series. We also have Cassie Haynes, co-executive director of Resolve Philly, and Robert Samuels, national political reporter for the Washington Post. Thank you for joining us today, and red pills only, so let's get started. Robert, what is an anti-racist, and what should anti-racist journalism be today?
Well, it sort of feels like that word's all over now, doesn't it? And it's an interesting word, and I think Ibram Kendi, the author, was the person who first popularized the term. When I think about anti-racism, I think about viewing everyone as having a race and recognizing that race is an active part of how we think and how we do, no matter what your race is. And so I think when we take that perspective to journalism, what we're really doing is practicing some of the fundamentals of journalism that we haven't been good at practicing. So, I think about asking myself a few questions is, are we keeping our obligations to everyone, every community, communities of color and not? And by doing that, we ask ourselves questions of, when we report on minorities, are we reporting on them as full people with complicated lives that are tugged and pulled by different sorts of things? And are we looking at their lives not just as a feature piece, but also as an accountability story? That their lives are being influenced by systems, by lawmakers who have an obligation to them as they do with anyone else in this country. So when I think about anti-racist journalism, I think about journalism that asks deep questions about why things are the way they are, that take nothing for granted, and also display an empathy for others.
Thank you, Robert. Leah, I would also like you to chime in on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really important about what Robert said is that this is an active thing. A lot of people talk about journalism in terms of it being racist or not racist, but I think anti-racist is really important because it takes it to the next step where it's not just enough to not say something that is explicitly racist or not say something that is harming people, but it's actively trying to change the way things are. And I think one thing that's really important too is that it can't just be an individual process. So I think a lot of times people who are trying to do anti-racist work really focus on themselves and like the stories they're telling, the language they're using, the people they're meeting, which are all really important things, but it's also part of a system. So um, part of that is being accountable to readers and listeners. Part of it is working with a team, having editors and coworkers and a whole system that is actively trying to do something together. So I don't think it can be something that is either that one individual journalist feels responsible for or is capable of changing alone.
Um, uh, you know, Cassie, I think you have an interesting perspective on this as well, and I think it'll lead into my next question, but I would like to hear from you before I ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other piece of anti-racism, and maybe the piece that's harder to talk about, particularly when we're thinking and acting towards institutional accountability, is that, you know, part of what Ibram Kendi offers is that it's a binary. There are two options, you know, there's anti-racist and there's racist. And so what does it mean when you are not an anti-racist organization? And I think that that's, or not practicing anti-racist actions, or not, you know, rooting your values and anti-racist ideals, right? And I think that that's the stickier part. That's the part that people don't want to talk about. It's really easy to kind of point to activities of, you know, diversity and inclusion and kind of, you know, we're look at this anti-racism, and that's not always the case.
Right. So, Cassie, can you tell us briefly about, you know, what Resolve Philadelphia is, and the model Broken Philly, and how that works to deconstruct racism in journalism?
Yeah, so Resolve Philly is an organization based in Philadelphia. We are a nonprofit that focuses on developing and advancing journalism that is rooted in collaboration and equity and the elevation of community voices and solutions. We are actively working on being an anti-racist organization, right? It's a practice, and I don't think it's a box that you get to check off like boom, 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 we're anti-racist. And so we integrate this not just in, you know, how our editorial team executes the collaborative reporting projects of Broken Philly, which is a, you know, collaborative reporting project of 25 newsrooms across Philadelphia. But this is also in our hiring practices and how we show up as an ally to the local news ecosystem in Philadelphia, how we show up to as an ally to journalists, not just the institutions, how we show up as an ally to communities. Trust is a real big deal. And one of the things that we really focus on is repairing that. It's damaged.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to double back, and I know that this was not a question that I had you guys read in advance, but you know, for Robert and Leah, I wanted to talk specifically about some of your work, especially with the Ask Code Switch series and Decolonizing Beauty, in your case, Leah, and Robert, you know, the story where you're telling how a teacher in Tulsa is navigating wokeness in 2020. How would you say your work is an example of this type of journalism that we should all be aiming to do?
Sure. So to give a little bit of background about what Ask Code Switch is, Code Switch is a team that has always been made up of people of color and seeks to serve an audience of color. And we make stories for everyone, but that's our primary goal. And one of the things we noticed about 4 years ago is that we were getting tons and tons of questions from people. And so we decided to create a sort of formal process where we would choose our favorite questions from the audience and try to answer them about how race and racism and different issues are playing out in their personal lives. So for the Decolonizing Beauty story, one of the questions we got was from a woman who asked if there were ways to decolonize her beauty routine. And I really loved that question because one, it was very practical in a way that our questions are often not. Like beauty is something that people on our team and people that I'm friends with and people in my family are thinking about all the time. It's not something that's like a theoretical out there thing. So that's one of the reasons the question appealed to me. But in the process of reporting out the answer, one of the things that we kept on hearing was that beauty was a tool, a political tool, both that people use as a sort of way to gain power and empower themselves, but also a very strict rule that keeps certain people from accessing certain things in certain places. And that a lot of people describe beauty as something that's natural and something that everyone agrees on, but it's actually a very created kind of top-down sort of definition of what beauty is. And in the reporting and in illuminating some of those dynamics, I think we were able to talk about beauty in a deeper way that actually exposes some of the ways that it keeps people of color, particularly Black women, particularly poor Black women, from being able to access certain spaces, right? So we were thinking about this not just as like a thing that is kind of like accessible to everyone, but the way that it has a different effect on different people. And I think that's kind of our goal in all of our reporting, is to look at these concepts that touch everyone and think about how they touch different people differently, and how things that can seem on the surface even like fun and empowering and like enjoyable can really just underline some of the inequalities that already exist in our society.
Those connect with a lot of the themes that I try to explore with the story that you mentioned, Juliet. And the story looked at a white woman who lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who is trying to come to terms with the racism she had and the racism she saw after George Floyd died. It's a situation that I think many people in this country resonate with. Toni Morrison once said, and I was watching the documentary a few days ago, it's that when most people write, they usually have a little white man on their shoulder. That's the person they explain to. And I think that's particularly true when we talk about general interest journalism. We think about who the audience is. It typically looks like that person. I think what the challenge is to have a few different types of people on our shoulder, you know? So I write with a little white man on my shoulder, and I write with a Black woman on my shoulder too. And I think about the sort of questions they'd have, the sort of things they'd respond to, what would feel right to them, what would feel obvious to them. And a lot of times, you know, it might be surprising, but there's a lot of similarity in between the two. And so like with this story, I thought one of the things that I wanted to do was to help explain something that I didn't fully understand, you know, watching some of my colleagues and some people on social media go through this process about reconciling their internal racism. But it was also a process of having them discuss themselves as white people. And that I think in the times that we live in, that's not a question. The question of whiteness and how it operates, how it influences what we do, what we think, what policies we like. It's not something that's often investigated. It's kind of taken for granted. And so I think when I think about that lens, that's what I think of. Who am I writing to? Who are the imaginary people on my shoulder? And where are the connections between those?
Cassie, I'm not sure if you wanted to add something there. I think that might be some important perspective on how collaboration works, especially in intersectionality.
Yeah, I think, you know, specifically with the way that collaboration works among the Broken Philly partners, you know, we have a partnership with the Philadelphia Inquirer, we have a partnership with HYY, you know, and we also have partnerships with, you know, smaller neighborhood outlets like Germantown Info Hub and Kensington Voice, some small radio stations. And so, you know, our partners have a range of resources that they have to execute their work as part of the collaborative. And so, you know, it's something that has been part of the approach from the beginning. My co-director, Jean Friedman-Rudofsky, when she started with the Reentry Project, recognizing, you know, what does collaboration look like when you've got the Inquirer and also, you know, like a one-person show doing all of the things and reporting super important stuff to communities that are not necessarily reached by the Inquirer, probably not reached by the Inquirer, right? And so we have a really transparent process around resources that we make available to the collaborative. As part of a recent grant that we got, we actually, a significant portion of the grant, $250,000, went directly into the local news ecosystem in Philadelphia as what we called a newsroom stimulus. When the pandemic hit, we recognized that our partners who are already struggling, newsrooms are already struggling, right? And so we wanted to inject cash into local newsrooms through the most efficient, no strings attached mechanism as possible. And so we earmarked $250,000 to buy ads and run PSA, community generated, culturally affirming public health PSA. And so we have since, I think we've got $126,000 that we've spent. The way that we've allocated that, we're super proud of. We have a whole blog post on it on Medium if you want to read more about it. But we absolutely took an anti-racist approach. Our charge with this grant was to facilitate information access to communities that are most vulnerable to the social, economic, and physical impact of COVID-19. And so with this funding and with the allocation of our advertising spends, we were able to really support newsrooms that focus on BIPOC communities, specifically Spanish language, specifically Black communities, specifically some of the smaller, more hyper-local organizations that really stepped up to provide service journalism across the communities. So, I mean, I think these are demonstrable ways within Resolve that, you know, it's not a conversation about anti-racism and what would an anti-racist organization look like. It's really, you know, it's not perfect, but really approaching resource allocation, contracts, hiring process with that in the forefront means that you don't have to have all of the conversations, you know, on the back end trying to figure out, we did it wrong, how do we fix it?
You know, journalists all work to be unbiased and, you know, honest arbiters. That's part of the job. That's part of our craft. But, you know, often we all prop up what Ibram X. Kendi refers to as collective subjectivity, kind of all agreeing on narratives and scenes, or what is unbiased and what is objective. But how do we talk about objectivity and neutrality, and how does that conversation often mask inequality?
Such a good question. I think one of the things that we need to recognize as journalists is that neutrality is a little bit of an awkward place to start, because our lives, our perspectives of things, they inform what we do and the type of questions we ask. So I think it's good to move to a methodology of fairness. How am I being fair to a community and to people who I'm reporting about? So when I go out to report a story, the first thing I try to do is I recognize my presumptions. I try to figure out what I think the story would say if I were to write it right now. And then I recognize that and I go on a pretty proactive check to see if those presumptions are right and to really challenge them. So one of the examples that I used is, I did this story looking at how COVID-19 was ravaging the lives of people in Milwaukee. The first people to die in the state of Wisconsin were all Black, and they're all from the same part of Wisconsin, the north side of Milwaukee. And back then, the idea, it seems so long ago, but back then the idea was that Black people were getting infected because they weren't social distancing, because they weren't taking this thing seriously. So it's very easy for a reporter to go drive around and look for examples of Black people not social distancing. That would be one way of doing the story. I challenge that the better way of doing the story is to make sure you're not driving around parks. It's to go out of the car and ask people why you're doing what you're doing. It's talking to folks in the community to tell them to ask them what they know about COVID-19 and to ask them why they think this is happening. And then you start getting a story that challenges some of those presumptions, but opens up a new lens for different types of readers. And I think that's the sort of work that we need to do. It's not about whether I can be a blank slate. I cannot. No one can. But it's about being able to challenge those presumptions and to also look at people with a lens that's natural to them and complex, because we're all complex people. And even as much as I try, I cannot fathom the life of walking in someone else's shoes. I need to go and figure out why they are walking the way they're walking.
Thank you, Robert. Leah, how are you handling this, in your conversations at Code Switch?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Robert mentioned. The other thing I think we think about and talk about a lot is even just how we're choosing stories to begin with. I think we focus a lot on, once you figure out what story you're going to do, how do you tell it? How do you ask questions in a way that's thoughtful and doesn't center your biases? But I think it's also just as important to think about and realize that what we're deciding what a story is, right? And that decision is something that we do from a position of power and a position of privilege. So, even if someone were just to take a video camera and record something that is happening, they're not narrating anything, they're not adding anything, they're choosing who's in the shot, they're choosing what to focus on. And you would get a completely different story if you flipped the camera and shot the other way. So we're thinking about that and thinking about, why are these the people that we're interested in? Why are these the things that we think are newsworthy, and this community is not newsworthy to us? Or this person dying is significant and this person dying is not going to make a headline. And, as you said, Robert, it's always making a choice, and we're never coming in as a blank slate. So we're still doing this work knowing that it's always a judgment call, and hopefully we can have enough perspective and challenge each other enough to make judgment calls that center people that don't usually get centered. But still, like, there are a lot of people and communities and issues that I don't know about and will never hear about. And that's part of the challenge too, is being open to that and knowing that there are a lot of important stories that will still never get told.
One of the things that we say at Resolve a lot, and that we believe really firmly, is that words either heal or they harm. and that the idea of the neutrality of a word it's not real. And so I think we focus a lot on language. We focus a lot on where language comes from and how language is used. We focus a lot on person first language that talks about the experience of a person rather than assigning a trait to that person, right? If you're talking about someone with the experience of homelessness, it is a more accurate and authentic story to talk about this person's experience of sleeping in a tent or sleeping in a car or sleeping, 10 to a studio apartment than to call that person homeless, right? Because that is a state, not a trait. And that language is not neutral. That is a big part of what we focus on.
Thank you. All of this work is difficult work, but it has to be done every day. Journalism can be either racist or anti-racist. So what should reporters, editors and folks leading newsrooms know about doing this work? And Leah, why don't we start with you?
One thing I think that is really important to know is that it is not a feel-good work. I think doing anti-racist journalism is hard, and I think it's meaningful and rewarding in a lot of ways, but I think especially right now when it's something that is on a lot of people's minds and kind of has the national attention, it's something that can feel almost exciting and like something that you can get in on. And my suspicion would be that in a year from now or in 6 months from now, it's not going to feel the same way. I know all of us on this panel have been trying to do this work for much longer than it's been in the national attention. And it's in changing the way that newsrooms think about themselves and that communities think about themselves and that we think about certain communities. I think it makes a lot of people mad and uncomfortable and forced to do a sort of reflection that can be very painful. It is painful for me a very good deal of the time. So I think that's important to know, not to dissuade people from trying to do anti-racist journalism, but just because it's something that the benefits of doing it and the reason for doing it, I think is something that is far off and is not going to be immediately rewarding, probably in any way that any of us will be able to see soon.
Thank you for sharing that. Robert?
I think one of the important things to remember is that, journalism is enshrined in our democracy. It's there in the First Amendment to make things work. And when we talk about, as keepers of that obligation, which is such a precious thing, it is important that we do that sort of work seriously. So when we talk about anti-racist journalism, I think it's important that we understand that we're not talking about something new. We're talking about upholding the values that we have as journalists, upholding our ethics and upholding our democracy in saying that everyone has worth, their perspectives have worth, and we are going to hold people accountable when they do not honor those perspectives. And that includes our organizations, but mostly that includes the type of questions we ask, the type of stories we pursue, and how we ask those questions and how we talk to those people.
Cassie.
I just don't have anything to add right now to what my colleagues are saying. I mean, I just, twinkle fingers. I think it's hard work.
I think that says it all. Let's go to Q&A. I see we already have a couple of questions in the queue. Let's get started with our favorite thing we love to talk about, which is deadlines. So Celia writes, sometimes, particularly when a reporter is on deadline, we talk to people who are in charge of something. And often when I cover nonprofits, for example, even those working to help communities of color, the people in charge are white and male. How guilty should I feel about quoting them because I'm short on time?
I would respond and say how guilty you feel about it is maybe between you and your God, but I think, you know, the practice of looking at an organization's website and checking out who else stands out as somebody to reach out to. You know, if you're looking at an organization too, I think always, you know, wanting to get at program participants and you know, to be fair, I am like the least journalist on this panel. I just started calling myself a journalist like 2 weeks ago. My background is not in journalism, and I haven't worked in a newsroom. And also, I have been the number two white men in charge, and that sucks. It sucks to be the person who is executing the work and never called on for the quote, never called on for the hook, never called on to you know, kind of give folks the good news. So, you know, I think going maybe the extra step of looking at the, you know, at the website and seeing if there's another person, you know, who is not that white man that you could reach out to.
Yeah.
That's sound advice. Leah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and I think that's really important, and to add to it, I think one of the nice things is that you always get another chance, right? So like I have so many times been on deadline and had to call the first person who would answer and do that story, but then you get to do another story. And I think the work and the responsibility is to figure out like, okay, what's the next story? We have to talk. This country is run by white men, right? We have to talk to them. We have to hear from them, but that can't be the whole story. We have to then hear like, who are the people that are going to be affected by these decisions or whatever they are, who disagrees, what are the other perspectives? And I think that's kind of, for me, the exciting part is to get to continue the reporting.
So we have another question that I think might tie into this in some respect. You know, the attendee asks, the community I live in and report on is small, Appalachian, and therefore also very white. I'm a white woman myself and I want to use my platform for good. How can I effectively reach out to Black folks and other minorities in my community and share my desire to share their stories without making them uncomfortable or seeming, I guess, or seeming like they're trying inauthentically?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to make sure you're trying authentically, right? Now, when we report, there's something different about us and the people we're reporting on. There's always a dynamic. And I think sometimes we can misstate or overstate, you know, if, as a, you know, a Black man, if I'm reporting on Black men, I don't necessarily get buy-in either. And as a Black person, I've been to lots of and reported on lots of different cultures. But I think there are some steps that you can do to help bridge this. The first thing to do is that before you go out and venture into a community you don't know, you should really have a conversation. The first interview should be with yourself about why you're going. What's your mission statement? And then I think the next thing to do is to be sure that you share that in as honest and as transparent a way as possible with people who might have a lot of skepticism. And in this country today, there's a lot of skepticism about journalists. And so I think if you make an idea, you know, I think Bob Woodward once said, the most important thing you can say to a source is, I need your help. It's letting them know that you're joining on a journey together to pursue truth and to excavate something that's real. And I think when you approach it from that perspective, your results are a little bit better. And also, when you acknowledge you don't know, that's a part of it. Like, our job isn't to affirm what we know. Our job is to figure out what we don't know. And so don't feel bad because you don't know. Journalism's about finding the answer.
Thank you. You know, I think it would help our audience a lot to know, like, what are some examples of when you thought this was done well, when anti-journalism was meeting what it claims to do? And it can be from your portfolio, so that would be great.
I look to a lot of people who I think have done really great jobs covering things on race and as a part of their everyday life. People like Scott Lowitz and Ann Hall and David Marinus. But also, I think from the accountability lens, some of the work that Nicole Hannah-Jones has done in terms of looking at things like school segregation. The case for reparations, I think, is another seminal work now in terms of not presuming America's race story is simply a story of how people live, but it's a story of systemic issues that go on. And I think work like that is really instructive.
I think so much of the anti-racism, or so much of service journalism is kind of steeped in anti-racist action. I mean, when you're talking about communities that are cut off from mainstream mechanisms for news and information delivery and engagement, and you look at an organization like Kensington Voice, you know, I think almost everything they do is service journalism because it is just so, you know, directly meeting the needs of the community, and that makes it, I think, anti-racist when you're able to say, here is a community that is cut off from information, and here is what we are doing to ensure that that is not the case. I think that piece of it is absolutely stands out as anti-racist.
We have a question about the power dynamics in newsrooms. Can you speak to how anti-racist efforts in journalism can, you know, be pervasive in these spaces, and how they can contribute to blind spots, especially when leadership is still largely white and male? Leah, would you like to go ahead and answer that?
Sure, yeah, and apologies, there's a lawnmower in the background. I don't know if you can hear it. I think that's a huge problem, and it's a huge ongoing concern. And I think one of the things that's a challenge is that changing the way work is done is hard. It takes resources, it takes time. And the people who already subscribe to a certain publication or are the most loyal listeners are that way because they like the way things work and they like the journalism that they're already getting. So I think there is sort of a, you know, people want to keep doing what they're doing because it works and it's successful and people feel good about what they're getting. And the thought of changing things is alienating to a lot of the people who are the current audience. And so I think there's a real challenge of making the case that doing a different type of journalism, changing the way we tell stories and think about stories is going to be better, but we're not going to see the results of that necessarily. It's not going to make more money. The people that are least served by racist journalism are not in a position to give journalists awards or to be the biggest donors to, you know, NPR stations or to have like the subscriptions to different things. So I think part of the kind of core problem is that this is an ethical concern and it is not necessarily going to make business sense to change, and we have to be willing to accept that fact.
Yeah, I see it a little bit differently, and I think it might be some of the difference between the funding model. But I think one of the things we have to understand is that, this is this is what we should be doing, and also in looking at the ways we tell stories and the lens in which we tell stories is also really important. For example, when Pete Buttigieg was running for president, there was a really eye-opening moment where people realized he wasn't winning over Black voters. And the Buttigieg campaign said, and most people believed, well, it's because they don't know him. Black people don't know him. So we should go out and do stories about him being introduced to the Black community. I think it was important for us to also ask the question of, have we considered that they know him and they don't like him? And also, why do we presume that no one knows him? Because he's been on every magazine cover and doing lots of press. People can say his name correctly, which is one of the campaign's first thing. So maybe the question we should ask is how well Pete Buttigieg knows the Black community. Maybe we should have a story that looks at his exploration about understanding race and racism and how that works. And I think that's a good journalistic principle. That's not something that an editor should have to struggle to understand. If they do, that's a different kind of conversation. But I do think there's an important thing to recognize, that there's a mutually beneficial reason to pursue this sort of work with this sort of lens. And for us, those types of stories, the hits do come and the subscriptions do come. So I just think it's about making sure that this discussion is about doing something that's responsible. It's not the revolutionary costume for the day. It's just how journalism's supposed to work.
Cassie, I didn't know if you wanted to have a say on that one as well.
Yeah, I think I was going to follow up with Leah, or on what Leah kind of closed her comment with. I also just think it's whose shoot. I'm sorry, I totally just lost my train of thought. I started to write it down as Leah was closing, and then I wanted to pay attention to what Robert was saying. Leah, do you remember what you had said right as you were closing?
I think that it's that doing anti-racist journalism is an ethical decision.
Yep, got it. Not because it makes business sense. What I was going to follow up with was, and also with exception of some of, I think Washington Post is maybe an exception right now. Those traditional models also aren't working. It doesn't make business sense to keep doing the same things that we've been doing because they're not working. And so I think a lot of what's holding newsrooms back is, to me, it really feels like it's rooted in fear. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear of what it means when other people are telling the stories. There's a lot of fear of what it means to look towards a new model for journalism. I'm in these conversations all the time, we need a new model, a new membership model, a new subscription model, a new this kind of model, a new that kind of model. If you're not going to re-examine the product, you have no business talking about a new model. You can't just slap a new business model on anybody. Anybody who's ever tried to sell a thing is going to tell you that you can't just slap a new business model on something, repackage the same thing that has been not serving communities for centuries, right? I'm in Philadelphia. Our legacy, paper of record is the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's 191 years old. That paper was not built for me. And I think, the fear of what it looks like to imagine a new Philadelphia Inquirer, what would it look like to revisit that mission statement? what would it look like to actually say, you know what, this is the paper of record, this is a legacy institution, and this is what it looks like for a legacy institution to move into an anti-racist future. That is powerful. And that's scary. That is scary.
I want to be respectful of time, but I do have one question that I think isn't in line with what I would like to close on, as well as from the audience. And it's, how do we make this more than the moment of 2020? You know, one audience member said, you know, I've seen this happen in the 60s and things changed after that. The moment might have been muddled. How do we make this part of the business model looking forward, that this is journalism 2020?
I mean, I think that's so much of a question. In journalism, you know, an industry that's been ravaged for so long, some places are finding their feet a little bit more. But those efforts that were built after the Kerner Commission, we've seen them deplete. And the fact of the matter was that if there were considerably more sustainable efforts to retain and promote people of color in newsrooms, maybe so many of them wouldn't have taken buyouts or been forced to be laid off. And so I think this is the fundamental question for lots of newsrooms. How do we keep the momentum going? I'd suppose a few things. One would be with hiring, right? It's not just enough, or it shouldn't be enough, and it should almost be malfeasance to only ask questions about diversity and incorporating this sort of mindset to people of color, right? That when we're looking at places to sustain ourselves, we're entrusting people who will make good decisions and who will not find these things to be a sort of niche, up and coming type of knowledge. So I think that's one of the things. And the second thing is to continue embedding the idea of doing work that looks at everyone fully and whole as fundamental parts of the ship, you know? And so if the ship goes down, that's not cargo that's thrown overboard. It goes down with the ship. And I think that's the way we need to start looking at things.
Leah?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard question. And I think I have no idea is the short answer. But I think one of the things that is important is thinking of people, broadening our ideas of who is an authority and who gets to tell certain stories. I think there have always been people, marginalized people telling their stories, willing to speak about what they're experiencing, and doing so in ways that are accessible. And it's a funny thing to say as someone who works for NPR, which is like, you know, very central and reaches a lot of people. But I think the thing that will keep this moment going is when people aren't just turning to NPR or to legacy newspapers or to the biggest corporations for their news, but when they're considering the people around them, the people that they live in community with, and the people who don't have these giant platforms as equally important and meaningful parts of telling the story of our country.
And Cassie with the final word.
Ooh, I mean, in terms of sustaining this work, I will say a few things. I think collaboration is a big part of it. Being able to leverage the resources and the gifts and the experience of our colleagues across the city, watching how our partners are able to harness those same things in one another to really do a service to Philadelphians, particularly you know, when it comes to economic mobility, which is, you know, a central focus of Broken Philly. I also think caring for your team, whatever that means. One of the things that, I saw somebody post a question about, what do you do to take care of your colleagues, yourself, your team when you're doing anti-racist journalism? That's a huge deal. That's a huge deal. I will say we have very open conversations as a team about mental health. I think that's hugely important. We are very generous with time off. We offer health benefits to employees regardless of full or part-time status, and we pay 75% of those benefits. We're less than 2 years old. And so I also want to point out that youth is not an excuse. If you prioritize taking care of the people who are a part of your team from the beginning, it is a part of the work that you do for always. And let me tell you that those decisions that we made a year and a half ago are paying dividends as we support our team through this pandemic. So that is one way that you can tangibly, actively practice anti-racism within your organizations and sustain that work.
Thank you. And for the final word, here's Julie.
Thank you, Juliet. You guys really have the final word. I'll just close with intense gratitude for the conversation that you guys had and have had before this and will continue to have after this, and particularly to say thank you for making the private conversation public. I think that's really a gift, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here today. I know we could talk much longer, but we do respect your time. The Journalism Institute is here to help. We have waived all of our fees since March in light of the pandemic at a savings of $52,000 plus for participants like you. And so we hope if you learn something, value your experience, that you will give this work a thumbs up and consider a donation as well. And we will send you a link to the video and all of the links that were shared earlier so that you have the opportunity to learn again from this program. That email will be coming to you very, very soon. And meanwhile, thank you again for being here, and stay well.
Thank you.